So I'll hand over to Vic. Chris.
I just want to check first of all whether you would rather we used microphones or not. People at the back, can you hear me? Victor, say something. This is how the best interviews start. Right?
It's so long since I had breakfast, I can't remember.
So we'll try without it, but if you can't hear, I'll keep an eye and I'll bung a hand up and I will start using microphones, but I'd rather avoid them if we can because we get the howl round and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, the reason we're here, first of all, thank you all very much indeed for coming. Great credit to you, given the time of year and the issues with COVID and so on and so forth. Great credit to you, great credit to Victor that he's drawn you here as well. So lovely to see you. The main reason we're here is to talk about this book, Victor's latest magnum opus, which is called Late Cuts, Musings on Cricket.
It's a parvum office, really.
Well, it struck me slightly odd in the sense that it's called Late Cuts, and then the picture on the front is of a lofted drive. We'll talk a bit more about the book in a minute or two. But there are one or two things I'd like to talk about first, and then we'll end up talking about the book. Victor, first of all, this year has been the year that you have been less fully and obviously employed because you retired from The Guardian and The Observer after 30 years, roughly, on the two.
Well, certainly 31 years for The Observer, and The Guardian only a Johnny-come-lately of about, I don't know, actually a dozen years. I kind of got subsumed by The Guardian.
And what have you missed, if anything?
Well, because of the peculiar circumstances of the last 18 months, not that much. In some ways, I'm grateful because life has become so much more complicated in terms of how you cover the cricket. Going to empty stadiums in 2020 to watch cricket was an odd experience. And obviously now this Ashes Tour the Ashes Tour is always the pinnacle, I think, for a lot of journalists. And a lot of journalists sort of plan to have their grand exit at the end of an Ashes Tour. Or not so grand exit, but that usually is a time to go. But actually, even though I've been in Australia for so many years while the Ashes have been going on, this time around, nearly all the journalists out there will have covered the Brisbane Test, the English journalists, from a hotel room in Sydney because of complications. I think they will physically be in Adelaide from now on, but you never quite know what's going to happen. There's so much uncertainty. So that bit I haven't missed. But I have missed, I guess, I hesitate to use the word banter because you can't use banter nowadays, but I have missed.
There's banter and banter.
Yeah, I have missed being in press boxes, having a free pass to Test cricket or international cricket. I've missed that a bit. But
mind you, press boxes must be very different places now to what they were 30 years ago, just in terms of the number of people, apart from anything else, and the technology.
Well, the technology has made a huge difference over the years. I mean, when I started, it was a phone, it was all you needed, and a pencil and a piece of paper, essentially. And then that sort of anguished phone call to your copy taker, who within about 2 minutes would be saying, is there much more of this? And then, so the ease with which you transmit your stuff, and press boxes suddenly became quiet in the last decade or more, because when I started, no one was filing any copy until about 6 o'clock in the evening, and no one really started doing any writing, any work until about 4:30, 5 o'clock. So there was constant conversations going on all the time.
Liquid refreshment.
Liquid refreshment at lunchtime was the standard fare. And a buzz, sometimes a loud buzz of conversation all through the day as you swap notes on whatever, might be the cricket. Whereas now everyone is working, the laptop is up like that. There is basically silence. Everyone is doing something on their laptop. I never knew quite what everyone was doing, but the laptops are up, they're all tapping away. A lot of people are filing reports at odd times of day, at 11:30. They're tweeting, they're blogging. So it was a completely different atmosphere by the end than when I started. When, as I say, it was quite a leisurely activity until about, I don't know, 4:30, when if you'd moved on to a laptop, you would open it and then hope the muse visited you. So it changed enormously.
It's been a depressing year on the cricket front overall, hasn't it? You take into account, for example, the cancellation of the Pakistan tour, the Rafiq allegations, for many of us, the 100, a number of things.
Indeed.
What did you make of some of that? What did you make, for example, of the decision? What would you have written if you had been writing on the cancellation of the Pakistan tour?
Well, this is, yes, I mean, in some ways, I'm glad I haven't been writing about the last 12 months because it's been bleak.
Grim.
And I think I would have taken a similar view actually to Mike Atherton, who wrote very strongly in the Times, criticizing the ECB for pulling out without any obvious clear evidence that this was the advice from the people on the ground in Pakistan, without any obvious consultation with the players involved. They just seemed to decide that it's too much hassle to go there for about 4 or 5 days, in the knowledge perhaps that some of the players would be happier playing in the IPL in the UAE. And it struck me that it was not a huge sacrifice for England to go there after what Pakistan had done in 2020, to come here, play those test matches. It was not a great sacrifice, nor a massive risk to go to Pakistan for about 5 days to play 3 2020 internationals. So I think Atherton was right to give them some stick on that.
Do you suspect it was Morgan's decision rather than Harrison's?
Well, it would not surprise me given Morgan's track record. I mean, we can praise Morgan for all sorts of things, but he's sort of pulled out of the odd tour, and it would not surprise me, but I don't know that he would have been very lukewarm about going. He was captaining the Calcutta Knight Riders at the time. We don't know that, I don't think. He would have been consulted, but I don't think any of the players were consulted. I don't think the women were consulted at all because they were due to go out at some point. But I don't know that.
It demonstrated to many people an appalling lack of leadership within the ECB, which has had a bad year anyway, with chairman coming and going, and a stand-in chairman now. There does appear to be a lack of focus and leadership at the top of the game.
Yeah, I mean, the one, I think, before we slate them, if we do, the one area where I thought they deserved great credit, and it seems a bit like ancient history now, was 2020, in terms of overcoming all the barriers around to provide international cricket. And that was some undertaking that had to persuade not only the cricketers involved and the touring teams, but also the government and all the authorities to enable us to have what were remarkably rewarding, I think, given the circumstances, 2 test series against West Indies, Pakistan, some one-day cricket as well, in front of totally empty stadia. So I think those were the finest hours of the ECB over the last 18 months. Like you, I suspect I wasn't waving flags triumphantly when the first 100 match was played at the Oval, or indeed at Cardiff, which is supposed to be my local team, even though it's in another country to the one I live in. And then, there's the racist issue, or the racism issue rather, which has obviously not been handled at all well at Yorkshire, and not particularly well at Lords either, or at the ECB.
Were you surprised by Rafiq's allegations, given I mean, obviously you haven't been in a dressing room for a while, but did this come as a big surprise to you? Because sometimes one gets the feeling that, rather like the BBC's problems with Martin Bashir, the bigger crime was the cover-up rather than the original sin. But were you surprised?
Well, I mean, not entirely. I take your point about the cover-up. That applies in a variety of walks of life, even as we speak, I suspect. Or as recently as Watergate. But I thought that testimony, the most powerful bit of Rafiq's testimony was when he was talking, he mentioned Michael Vaughan, he mentioned Joe Root, and he was at the parliamentary committee there giving his testimony, and he said something like, I don't think they would have remembered. I don't think they would have recognised that they had said anything that was at all hurtful. So it wouldn't surprise me if they don't remember saying that, or in Root's case, saying that I don't recall seeing any sort of racist behaviour within a dressing room. And then I sort of thought about that, and I thought that makes absolute sense to me, because and the other thing that puzzled me was, without going with Michael Vaughan being so categorical, I did not say that. Well, I can't remember what I was saying in any dressing room or any cricket pitch a dozen years ago. And especially if what I was saying was meant to be some sort of slightly smart ass comment that was a bit of a joke. You just don't remember that. But you might remember it if it's directed at you in a way that wasn't meant to be hurtful, that was unwitting. That I sort of chimed with. I can imagine that happening, not just in cricket dressing rooms, but in practically every walk of life. Someone says something which they think is quite funny, which probably isn't, but it's not meant to be a piercing, hurtful comment. But it is hurtful, and you don't realize it. And I think, so that bit, when I thought about it, didn't surprise me. I thought that was Rafiq's most powerful argument, and also one that could be quite beneficial, because it's, once you make that realization that if you're in any sort of organization and you toss out what you think is, a mildly funny, provocative remark, Rafiq eloquently told us, actually, that's very often not the case. So in a way, I think that's an easy thing to learn for everyone else finding themselves in a dressing room or in an office. It's an easy thing to kind of get stuck into your head now. So that's the most powerful bit about it.
Do you think Vaughan has been correctly suspended, punished? And do you think he'll return?
Well, I'm pretty sure.
I mean, you're
I don't know.
You're a TMS colleague of his, so you know him well.
I mean, yes. Well, I think he will. I think he will come back, or be allowed to come back. He's obviously desperately keen to come back, but I don't quite know when. Whether it's at the beginning of next summer, or whether he has to wait a bit. So I think he will return. I mean, it's almost. I mean, I have the wisdom, like you, I expect, not to be on Twitter.
I know I got some wisdom.
Or, I mean, if you are, I'll start following you, but I don't think you are, whatever that means. So, in fact, again, it's a sort of bit about the cover-up. Vaughan was so categorical. I didn't say that. Well, I'm not sure you can be. And also, he did. We all read. He's a man of many opinions, and he tweeted. It's not. And then he's regretted some of his tweets, some about, coming to London and having to learn a different language, that sort of stuff. Doesn't look good, does it? So I think, he is chastened, and he probably should be chastened, but I'm not sure he should be banned for life from broadcasting. I think how long he'll be chastened for, I'm not entirely sure.
One of the high spots of broadcasting a year was, I think everyone agrees, Michael Holding's contribution to this whole racism debate. And of course, it's very sad that we won't be seeing him anymore, because he's retired, he's left Sky, he's going to settle in the Cayman Islands, and that'll be more or less that, we think. But that was a hugely impressive performance.
Well, it was
memorable.
It was. I mean, it was stunning, and I've written about that actually in there, as when I set off, in that it was the most fortuitous rainstorm of all, right at the start of the series against West Indies 2020, that allows Sky, they obviously had made this feature with Michael Holding and Everly Rainbow Brown. And a lot of people would have switched on to see this cricket, live cricket, and it was raining. And instead they played this, 15 minutes, and it was potent stuff. And Michael extremely eloquent. And Ebony also was impressive, and kind of mirrors what I was saying earlier, that she spoke about her experience, mostly I think when she was not so much playing for England, but possibly at the Oval, hurtful remarks that you thought would have just bounced off her, but she had found very hurtful along the way, unwitting, and that mirrored it in a way what Rafiq was saying. But that was amazing television. And then, of course, we went into some live television where it was still raining, and Michael going off in all directions about, well, all coming from all angles, and incredibly powerful stuff. And the sort of that combined with Rafiq is made it an issue that shouldn't just be swept away.
And he's written a book as well, hasn't
He has, yeah.
he?
Which is not so much a cricket book, but he's written a book which he ends up talking to, you know, Thierry Henry and all sorts of Michael Johnson, Usain Bolt. So it's an impressive piece of work, actually.
We can't let this go by. You mentioned a little while ago the 100.
Yeah.
And you promised in this book, at the beginning of this book, not to mention it again. But you couldn't resist it. But you wrote before we had 100.
Yes,
right?
this was published
Has
in
your
June.
view changed at all about it, given that by many people's accounts, it's been pretty successful, particularly for women's cricket, and also in terms of houses being pretty full? Are you still?
Well,
opposed to
I haven't had a Damascus-like experience as I crossed the Severn Bridge. I mean, what is undeniable is that it has been extremely beneficial for women's cricket, raised the profile, raised the income for some of the. So it has been a great success, I think, for the women's game. I don't think, despite all the trumpeting, that it will have given much benefit to the men's game. Because of this reason, I think it just ruins the domestic schedule in this country. Somehow you've got to shoehorn 4 competitions in, and there isn't enough space. Certainly last season, we haven't got next year's fixture list, and they may try and amend this a bit.
And that, incidentally, is being delayed and delayed because of not knowing what's going to happen to Yorkshire.
Yes, yeah. But last season, essentially, the prime months, June, July, August, short form cricket, either T20, which I like, just like everyone else, or 100. So
actually, can I just check? Were you in favour of T20 when it was first?
Well, not especially, no. But I accepted that. I remember going to my first ever T20 match was at Taunton, inevitably, and Somerset playing Warwickshire. Stands were full. And what impressed me more than anything, actually, was the players. They were desperate to, you know, I always used to disagree with Bumble, who said it was all hit and giggle. But actually what impressed me is that both sides were desperate to win, partly because there was 6,000 to 7,000 in there and you want to play well. And partly somehow, you know, you're playing for your club, your county, and you wanted to win. And I was sitting alongside John Inverarity, curiously, who was coach of Warwickshire, who's the most wonderful, sort of refined Aussie, apart from Claire, you can come across. You know, a sort of Brearley-esque figure in Australia. And one of his men misfielded, and he was effing and blinding, like, hey, what's going on? So it really seemed to matter right from the word go. And I was a very quick convert to that. The grounds were full. It seemed to, gradually, it seemed to matter. You cherish trying to win. So,
and you don't think that's the case with 100?
Well, no, not yet, or hopefully not ever. But what I don't like most of all is I think any cricketer with a brain, a young cricketer with a brain, who wants to make a good living, will look at this schedule that is here, coupled with what happens in the winter with lots of T20 competitions around the globe, and they'll think, well, what do I need to do to be a successful professional cricketer? And the answer is, at the moment, or increasingly, is that I need to be able to smack 30 off about 12 balls when I'm batting. And if I'm bowling, to concede less than about 25 off 24 balls. That's what I need to do. We're lucky at the moment, I think, in that the top players, Kohli, let's say, Danways by and large, Stokes, Root, they all cherish Test cricket. They love, they recognise probably that it's the hardest form of the game. And it really matters to them what they do in Test cricket. I worry that the next generation will look at what's available, and they won't worry about the red ball game, and Test cricket will diminish as a consequence. And there's one little example, again from Somerset. There's a guy called Will Smead, who is a young Somerset-born player, plays for Bridgewater actually, club cricket. But suddenly he found he's a terrific striker of ball. He's played some T20, then he got snapped up in the 100 and played it really well. He's never played a red ball first-class match. And actually a great nephew of mine plays with him for Bridgewater. And he said, he's got no idea whether he could prosper in red ball cricket. He hasn't a clue, doesn't know whether he can play at all in that format. But then why should he worry about that? Because he could end up with a big 100 contract, a T20 contract in the Caribbean, or ultimately even the IPL where you want to go. Why bother trying to become a broad cricketer who can play in all forms? That's what worries me about it. It creates a schedule that just can't work, I think.
I'd like to move on now, talk a bit about the book.
Okay, right.
Which is sort of why we're here.
It's a long time since I wrote it.
Well, I mean, what you do is you take a number of aspects of the game and devote a chapter to them. The sort of aspects of the game which are either taken for granted or are not considered interesting enough to stand on their own 2 feet, like selection, declarations, lunches, press conferences, and so on. And write very entertainingly with good inside knowledge on all that. Now let's look at 1 or 2 of those. Declarations cricket's the only game that has anything like that. And
I think so, yeah.
And I mean, speaking for myself, and I suspect quite a lot of people here, I always used to find declarations extremely frustrating because I was always wanting the captain to declare a lot sooner than he ever did, or she did. And then they were always right anyway, which made it even more frustrating. But I mean, declarations is a fascinating topic in its own right, because you don't get that in other sports.
No, it is. I think it's an artificial way of hopefully terminating the game, I suppose, and that doesn't quite happen in other sports. I suppose it sort of happens in golf in the way that if once you've won, you just walk off. You're 5 up with 4 to play or whatever. And it comes, and declarations, well, they are less important now. When I was playing championship cricket, red ball cricket, back in the 80s, let's say, it was an absolutely key element of the game. And in championship cricket, your attitude to declarations was hugely different to what you saw in Test cricket, because Essex, let's say, or Middlesex, really, or Keith Fletcher, I mean, they were masterful captains, but what they were also very good at, especially Fletcher actually, was somehow seducing the opposition into making that declaration that probably wasn't a great idea and wasn't necessarily in their favor, but he had this way of kind of manipulating your mind almost to make a declaration that was a little bit foolhardy, or he would make one that seemed a bit foolhardy, but he kind of knew when the odds were in his favor, like Ray Illingworth at Leicester. He would make declarations that seemed very generous, but he knew that it was doing a little bit more than everyone else thought, and that he would have enough time to bowl the opposition out.
But there have been declarations that have gone horribly wrong.
Well, it doesn't matter. Yeah, in championship cricket, it didn't matter too much because you would forfeit the odd loss for a couple wins along the way. Didn't matter if you lost, but obviously in Test cricket, you don't like to lose a match after a declaration, and you always remember the ones.
Gary Sobers.
Well, yeah, Sobers is there. Joe Root's there actually. Clive Lloyd did it once. The only Aussie I could find to do it. Well, who do you think was the only Australian? I say it's not the only Australian, but the one that springs to mind certainly in Ashes cricket. Which Australian? Correct. Thank you. I knew it wouldn't take long. Correct. And he was only a stand-in. So for all the gung-ho stuff from the Aussies, they don't declare unless they know they're safe, by and large. Headingley, of course, it always happens at Headingley, doesn't it? Norman Yardley, famously, and Gilchrist. They got something in common. Joe Root, Headingley. People go mad at Headingley. But it's... So, and then Alan Border's the nearest gung-ho Aussie, who famously declared in Chennai, as is now, and the match was tied. So that was a pretty good declaration, I thought.
Well, now you've been listing a number of captains, and you have a chapter on captaincy
Yeah.
as well. And again, captaining in cricket is not like captaining any
I
other
think
sport.
no.
Partly because of the nature of the game and what happens on the field, but there's a huge off the field responsibility as well. And you don't necessarily have to be the best player in the team to be the best captain.
No, and often, often it's a mistake to make the best player captain, perhaps. Certainly, I mean, that role has changed a bit, but it's still wonderfully important in a way that doesn't apply to other sports. Certainly at county level, all those years ago, the coach was of minimal importance. At most clubs in the 70s and 80s, that he looked after the balls, really, and organised a rota for the net practice and hit some catches. And the captain was the man running the cricket. That was the way it was, certainly through the 80s. And just started to change just as I was finishing, probably in the late 80s, and then the balance between captain and coach tilted. But it's still, and this is one of the, I think, the great attractions of the game. Even now, with all the analysts, iPad coaches of all sorts, half a dozen of them, it's still really, the captain still has a huge influence. Joe Root has a huge influence on what happens on the pitch, obviously, because you're out there for a long time, and also in the decisions made before you go on the pitch. And it's an amazing juggling act. And I would hate it. See, I think I'm saying there, I'd hate it if everything got so clinical that the analysts would be sitting there with their laptop going, boom, 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 boom. Oh, so-and-so should now bowl from the pavilion end, or, oh, now we declare. And the captain is really just the cipher out in the middle. I mean, there was that World Cup, do you remember 1999? Hansi Cronje was wired in to Bob Woolmer.
Yeah.
And they spotted it. It was spotted and they had to stop. It was an intriguing, bit of work by the South Africans. But the logical outcome of that actually the captain just becomes someone who carries out the decisions that have been sent to him in his ear, I would hate, because I love the decision making that he has to make, and whether he follows his intuition or indeed some of the stats that he's been given, how he balances that all out is fascinating.
The captain's still being strongly guided from off the field, aren't they? I mean, every time
More
somebody
now,
comes on
yes.
with a new pair of gloves, it's not because he's got sweaty hands, it's because the coach wants him to do something.
Yeah, well, yes, except the real good ones. I mean, Owen Morgan, for example, I mean, he will take in all that information, but he'll still do what his gut tells him, I think, which is very often it's the 18th over of a 20-over match, and he'll chuck it to Rashid to bowl his leg breaks, which you think, oh, what's he doing now? But sometimes it works. So he still follows his gut. And I think even with all that knowledge, even with all that knowledge, I think the captain can still should have the freedom to follow his gut rather than to obey the analysts.
I mean, you've captained a bit, but would you like to have been a full-time captain?
Well, I was briefly, I was for a season and a half at Somerset and years ago at university. And actually, I would have liked to have done it more. Although when things go wrong, you think, why? Derek Underwood famously, famous Derek Underwood quote, which really starts his Art of Captaincy book with is, why does anybody want to be captain? Says Derek Underwood. And he's got a point. But you're lured in because when it works, it's fantastic. You're like a puppeteer and everything falls into place. And Brearley would have experienced that lots of times, and just occasionally, I would have done, but not very often. But it's very rewarding when it all works. You're in charge, quietly.
You also have a chapter about selection. And since your book was written, England have given up the idea of selectors and just gone a bit like football with a coach and a captain, and that's it, more or less. Do you think that's a move in the right direction?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think Bumble, David Lloyd, when he took over as coach, would have liked that format, partly because he was such an avid football fan. Manchester United, he wanted to be Alex Ferguson, but that's how he would have liked to have done it, I think, in that role. And now Chris Silverwood, different sort of character, finds himself, he is in charge of selection. There's a couple of downsides. One is it makes him more vulnerable because when it all goes wrong, he's culpable or he's the man with the responsibility. And the other danger I would say is that if you're in a dressing room all the time, by and large, instinctively, you want to remain loyal to the guys in that dressing room. And it's a very noble sort of feeling. So I think there is still good reason to have someone who is a bit removed with a greater sense of perspective, who can look at the broader picture, who can certainly ask questions of a Silverwood or someone in that dressing room to say, hang on a minute, looking from the outside, this is what I think. And what about 18 months down the line, etc. That sort of viewpoint.
Yeah, the other problem that Silverwood has got, presumably, is that he doesn't see anything other than international cricket. So he can't assess players around the counties, whichever format it is, players on the way up, players who've done well and lost their way and are getting back, all that, which if you've got like a selection, ideally a selection committee, but certainly one or two people who are officially part of the thing, you get round that and you educate the coach and the captain as to who out there is worth considering.
I think that is true, although I think during the COVID period, they had such big squads. They had people out 40 or 50 England likely players joining that bubble. So they got quite a good insight into the capabilities, even though it was mostly in the nets in the middle, which is not, perfect. But they had a greater awareness of suddenly the top 35 or 40 England players because they were all training together. And the other thing that is obviously different, that in years gone by, as you can imagine, selectors would trek up to Headingley to go and watch Yorkshire's latest whiz kid, and he'd be out second ball, and you were none the wiser. Whereas now, with the magic laptop here, you can watch any player with a package put together of his last half a dozen innings in the morning. So you still need that personal sort of link with either the player or his coach to learn about character, but you can see how the bloke plays on a screen. So maybe, in that sense, you don't need so many men out in the field, perhaps, but you still need those very good contacts between players or umpires you trust or coaches about X or Y.
The chapter in the book that I was most interested in, rather a gloomy subject, was failure. Because
you're unfamiliar with it.
Because again, cricket is harsh in that department. I mean, every time somebody's out, he's failed. And he doesn't have a second chance, whereas a bowler does. And you could understand why certain famous folk like Ram Prakash and others have treated the dressing room with some disdain when they've got back in there, having been got out, whatever they've got. It is a very harsh game in that sense, particularly for batsmen.
I think so. I mean, two things really. If you're a batsman, even if you're one of the best batsmen, you fail. A really, really good batsman probably fails 4 times out of 10, three times. And quite a good one fails at least 5 times. And a perfectly respectable first-class cricketer probably fails 3 or 4, 6 times out of 10 perhaps. So you have to get used to failing. It's one of the challenges of the game. And the other thing about it is that everyone notices. If you're out for naught and they still print the scoreboards in the morning paper or it's on Crick Info there or whatever, it's there for all to see. You have failed. Whereas even in your career as a broadcaster, you might think you failed sometimes to get to the bottom of an argument. I doubt it happens very often, but you might think that. But most people wouldn't have noticed that at all. So the public nature of the failure is most obvious for batsmen, but it can happen to bowlers as well when it's 0 for 150 off 23 overs. It doesn't look great. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting one because I didn't see much of the last test. I only saw bits of highlights. I'm sort of wanting to come to Leach's defence very quickly. But the bits, there's a chapter in there on, I think it's on one about bowling, when I put little quotes at the start of each chapter. And one of them was on essentially on bowling, but spin bowling, was it was all right when it left my hand. Perfect. And it just so happens that the bloke at the other end run down the pitch and smacked it for six. And my impression, albeit from very skimpy highlights, that poor old Jack Leach, well, he kept getting hit for six, but they weren't bad balls. The situation wasn't great, and obviously it wasn't doing enough for him to befuddle the batsman. But it goes down, it's failure. 13 overs, 1 for 102. What do you conclude? This is failure. So you have to learn to live with that. And that's another, in a way that perhaps other team sports you can hide a little bit. You can play for Crystal Palace in the midfield and have a dreadful game, but it may not be that obvious.
No, unless you're the goalkeeper.
Yeah.
But I mean, to take a couple of other names, one of the guys who always interested me is how he rose very fast and looked so good and then vanished. Mark Lathwell.
Yeah.
Now, my memory of this is that he and Trescothick began more or less together, opened the batting together, and Lathwell, from a distance, looked potentially the more talented, the better player, and got into the England side, I think, before Trescothick. And
a long way before,
and he no sooner got into the England side than he was out the England side, and very soon he was out of the game altogether. And that struck me, that was interesting, and he vanished. And then you contrast that with Hamid, of now of Nottingham, who had a blisteringly good start, fell away unbelievably badly, such that Lancashire couldn't pick him. And now he's back and he's in the England side. Is it just different people cope in different ways?
Well, Lathwell is slightly older than Trescothick, but I live about 40 minutes from the county ground at Taunton. And there was, in the early 90s, Lathwell and Trescothick opening the batting. And then you look on the Cricket Info, and Somerset won the toss and they're batting, and they're 15 for no wicket off 2 overs. And then you had to make that decision. Do I get in the car to go and watch this? Because Lathwell and Trescothick in harness was fantastic, but they were also unreliable. So do I get in the car or not? Lathwell was an enigma. He played shots, and he started after I'd finished at Taunton, but only just after I'd finished. I think Chris Tavray was captain when he started. And Tav, who was not one given to hyperbole, would tell me that he just plays some shots that made him gasp. Just simple shots, but ones that you couldn't quite work out how he did it. Hitting balls for four that shouldn't go for four through mid-on, through mid-wicket. So he had a special talent. And then he got picked for England in the sort of 90, whenever the Aussies were touring, 93, 94, opened the batting with Atherton. And didn't say a word. I mean, Atherton it just didn't speak, says Michael. And also, Michael talks about the fact that, he certainly get the impression, which might well have been true, this is Lathwell, that he didn't really want to be there. So he had a prodigious talent, or a fantastic ability to hit the ball. But one wonders whether the research, if you like, of the England selectorial setup, and they were desperate to pluck out some young pup, as England were losing badly to the Aussies, some charismatic, whether I don't think they had done sufficient research on not Lathwell's ability to hit a cricket ball, but his temperament and his character. And he might, perhaps with different handling, have matured a bit and then really wanted to play for England. I'm not sure he wanted to play for England when he got picked. He hated having all this attention. So he was a one-off.
But Hamid is an interesting
Hamid,
rare case too.
Well,
you can hardly get to the second 11 of Lancashire.
Well, his regression. I mean, I remember watching Hamid in India when he made his debut, and Trevor Bayliss was coach, and Bayliss thought he was fantastic. Just in terms of temperament, he was really mature, up for it. He scored runs. He batted with a badly damaged finger at one point. He got runs, and it looked like he was there, forever. And then it took a long time to recover, and he couldn't score a run. But I think he might be able to be used as an example of a better system whereby he hasn't been abandoned, he's had a real massive drop. He's left one club and joined another. And it's possibly coming out the other side. We'll see. I mean, it's still a big leap. There are two big leaps, obviously, from county cricket to Test cricket. One is the standard can be much higher, especially if playing against Australia's pace attack. But the other is adjusting to this intense scrutiny that you just don't get at county level. And maybe Hamid is now ready for that. Let's hope so.
It raises questions about mental health too, because looking back over the last few years, the names of those good players who have struggled at one time, Trescothick being one, Trott being another, Stokes being another, Michael Yardy of Sussex being another. Was there much evidence of mental strain 20, 30, 40 years ago? And if not, what do you, I mean, these guys are two good players and so many of them. It can't just be chance, can it?
Do you think it's therefore an increasing issue?
Yeah, it looks like it, doesn't it?
Well, I suppose so. Although I mean, obviously the trite observation is that 40 years ago, people might have been suffering the same way, but you just wouldn't have said anything, and you'd have just been miserable on tour, especially when you're stranded on tour.
Did you, without naming names, did you ever come across in your whole career anybody who, looking back on it now, you thought was mentally really struggling, and for all you know may still be?
I don't think when I toured I did. I mean, the odd thing is one of the sort of aids in the old days, curiously, was the fact that you actually roomed with you were rooming with someone. And obviously, and I'd hate to room with anyone at my age now, and I'm sure the modern cricketer would much prefer to. Yeah. I used to lurch actually from Both one week to Chris Tavray the next. Well, how can I get into a rhythm? But when it worked well, there was this kind of system, unwritten system, that you kind of looked after your roommate. I mean, a good example, actually, who you've probably listened to, I think it's fair to say, was Derek Randall, who I did talk to. And we all know how wonderful Derek is, and we've all watched him joyfully, if we're old enough, in a field and being, you know, impish and instinctively witty and, you know, a great charismatic figure. But actually on tour, he could easily just go into hibernation, take to his room from about 6:30 onwards and not surface again. So he was a kind of a mixture between extrovert on the one hand, but also quite capable of just wanting to disappear out of the limelight. He wasn't a big sort of drinker, diner. And sometimes I remember, you know, tour way back in the Ashes tour, probably, that someone would, probably his roommate, would kind of drag him out. Come on, not for a big night out, but just to get out of that room, stop staring at that wall, and come out and have a beer and a chat. And that would be very helpful. Now, no doubt people still keep an eye open, but it was very much the roommate. If you had a good pairing, and you'd be in the same pairing for about 3 weeks when I told, unless it was all going wrong. Both and Eddie Hemmings had to be split because apparently Eddie's snoring was keeping Ian awake. But they just didn't gel particularly well. So there was a bit, anyway, that could help. But now, of course, gladly, people are much more prepared, thanks to the likes of Trescothick, especially, I admire.
Yes, because he did that awful interview, didn't he?
Yes, yeah, where he
tried to laugh off with it.
Said it was a virus.
Yes,
but then yes, he did. That was a big mistake. Yeah. He had the courage to say, actually, that was nonsense. And in a curious way, I mean, I'm obviously very fond of Trescothick. 70 Test matches he played for England, one of our best opening batsmen. But you could argue that he's achieved more in the sort of next 5 years after he no longer played for England in terms of helping people, giving them an awareness of that. Hang on a minute, if he can acknowledge that he's had certain issues, why can't everyone else? So I think looking back, would have been players who suffered quietly as opposed to acknowledging it, I guess. That's my guess.
I'm going to draw the first part of the afternoon to a close, just to, I strongly recommend this. It's fantastic Christmas, winter evening reading because it teaches you things you don't know. It reminds you of things that you've forgotten. It's very amusing, very entertaining, and very, very worthwhile. And I have to say, unbelievably generously priced as well. And I do not have shares in it, but I do strongly recommend it. We'll stop for about 15-20 minutes now and have the raffle as well. And then the floor is yours. Okay.